On a summer afternoon in the year 1030, beneath a sky that had begun to darken at the wrong hour, a man stood on a hillside in central Norway and watched his own people come to kill him. He was 35 years old. His hair was light, his beard full, his body still carrying the density of a man who had spent half his life on the decks of warships. He wore mail that had been forged in the workshops of Christian Europe, and at his hip hung a sword whose name the sagas would remember, Hneitir, the cutter, though the blade itself would be lost within a generation. Around him stood perhaps 3,000 men, most of them farmers and freedmen from the inland valleys, men who had followed him not because they loved war, but because they believed, as he believed, that this hillside was where God intended him to stand. Across the shallow valley, in numbers that the sources variously estimate at 10,000, 12,000, or simply many more, stood the army that had come to end him. And here was the strangeness that no saga could quite explain away. That army was also Norwegian. Those were Norwegian farmers marching under Norwegian chieftains, carrying Norwegian axes, singing, some of them, the old Norwegian songs. They had not come to repel an invader. They had come to kill their king. The place was called Stiklestad. The date was July 29th, though some modern astronomers have argued for the 31st, based on the behavior of the sun. Because the sun did something that afternoon that the men on both sides would remember for the rest of their lives. It dimmed, it faded. The light went strange and gray and wrong, as though evening had arrived at midday, as though God or the old gods or the universe itself had paused to watch what was about to happen. The man on the hillside noticed. He could not have failed to notice, but whatever he thought, whether he took it as an omen of doom or a sign of divine witness or simply an atmospheric peculiarity, he did not record. What he did, according to the sources, was give the order to advance. His name was Olaf Haraldsson. Within 18 months of his death on that hillside, he would be declared a saint. Within a generation, his body would be enshrined in a silver reliquary in the cathedral that would rise above his grave. Within a century, he would be venerated across Scandinavia, in England, in Iceland, in the trading posts of the Baltic. Churches would bear his name. Miracles would multiply around his relics. He would become, and would remain for nearly 1,000 years, the patron saint of Norway, Rex Perpetuus Norvegiae, the eternal king. And here is the paradox that the sources preserve but cannot resolve. The people who killed him were the same people who canonized him. The farmers who cut him down at Stiklestad were the fathers and grandfathers of the farmers who would kneel before his shrine. The chieftains who had rebelled against his reign were the same chieftains who would swear oaths on his holy bones. Norway rejected Olaf Haraldsson so violently that they ended his life with axes and spears on a summer afternoon. And then, almost immediately, they began to worship him. This is the story of how a teenage raider from the fjords of eastern Norway became in sequence a pirate, a mercenary, a Christian convert, a conquering king, a religious revolutionary, a hated tyrant, a failed exile, a martyr, and finally an eternal saint. It is a story about violence and faith, about the gap between intention and consequence, about the strange alchemy by which some deaths become more powerful than the lives that preceded them. It is a story that the medieval North told itself for 500 years, that shaped the identity of a nation and that remains, in the churches and place names and constitutional law of modern Norway, a story that is not yet finished. But before we can understand the saint, we must first understand the man. And to understand the man, we must begin not at Stiklestad, but 35 years earlier, in the chaotic, fragmented, violently contested landscape of late 10th century Norway. The Norway into which Olaf Haraldsson was born, around the year 995, was not a country in any sense we would recognize. It was a geography, a long, mountainous, deeply fjorded strip of coastline stretching from the Skagerrak to the Arctic, but it was not a polity. There was no Norwegian state. There was no Norwegian king whose authority ran from one end of the land to the other. There were instead dozens of petty kingdoms, hundreds of chieftains, thousands of independent farmers who owed allegiance to no one but their immediate lords and considered themselves bound by no law but the law of their local thing, the regional assembly where free men gathered to settle disputes and declare judgments. This was not primitive chaos. It was a highly developed system of decentralized governance, a society organized around honor, kinship, and reciprocal obligation rather than centralized command. A chieftain's power depended not on his title, but on his ability to attract and retain followers, to distribute wealth, to win battles, to be the kind of man other men would choose to follow. A farmer's freedom was real and jealously guarded. The thing assemblies were genuine deliberative bodies where common landholders could speak, vote, and constrain the ambitions of the powerful. The system had survived for centuries. It had produced the seafaring technology, the navigational skill, the martial culture that had made the Scandinavians the most formidable raiders in the medieval world. But by 995, that system was under pressure. To the south, in Denmark, a new kind of kingship was emerging, centralized, Christian, connected to the power structures of continental Europe. The Danish king Harald Bluetooth had converted to Christianity around 965 and had spent the next 2 decades trying to impose his faith and his authority on his neighbors. His son Sweyn Forkbeard would continue the project, and Sweyn's son Canute would eventually rule an empire that stretched from the North Sea to the Baltic. To the west, in England, the Viking raiders who had once come only to plunder were now settling, converting, intermarrying, and becoming part of the Christian European order. The old ways were not yet gone, but they were no longer inevitable. Into this world of competing systems, the old decentralized North and the new centralized Christian South, Olaf Haraldsson was born in the petty kingdom of Ringerike in the interior uplands west of the Oslo Fjord. His father was a minor king named Harald Grenske, a man whose ambitions outran his resources. His mother was Åsta Gudbrandsdatter, the daughter of a local chieftain. The family claimed descent from Harald Fairhair, the 9th century conqueror who had, according to later tradition, first unified Norway, though modern historians are skeptical about both the unity and the lineage. What we know with more confidence is that Olaf's father died young, killed in a fire while visiting a Swedish princess, and that Olaf was raised in his stepfather's household. The stepfather was a man named Sigurd Syr, another minor king of the inland valleys, a man the sagas remember as cautious, practical, and unromantic, the kind of ruler who preferred negotiation to battle and cattle to glory. The contrast with his stepson would become a recurring motif in the sources. Because Olaf, from the earliest age, wanted glory. The sagas describe him as stubborn, willful, physically brave, impatient with the compromises of domestic kingship. He wanted to be a warrior. He wanted to be a Viking in the old sense, a sea raider, a plunderer, a man who took wealth at sword point from those too weak to defend it. And sometime around the age of 12, according to our best reconstruction, he got his wish. The sources are imprecise about the chronology of Olaf's early raids, and we must be careful here. Our primary accounts, the sagas of Snorri Sturluson, written nearly 2 centuries after the events they describe, are literary constructions as much as historical records. They draw on earlier sources, some of which survive and some of which do not, but they also impose narrative shape, dramatic logic, and didactic purpose on events that may have been considerably messier than the stories suggest. When we read that Olaf first went raiding at 12, we should understand this as very young rather than a precise age. When we read that he commanded his own ship by 14, we should understand this as impressively early rather than a verified date. What we can say with reasonable confidence is that Olaf Haraldsson spent his teenage years and early 20s doing what ambitious young Scandinavian men of his era did. He went abroad, he raided, he fought, he accumulated wealth, reputation, and followers. The geography of his early campaigns, as the sources reconstruct it, traces an arc across the entire raiding world of the early 11th century, from the Baltic coasts of what are now Poland, Lithuania, and Finland, down through the Danish Straits, around the Jutland Peninsula, across the North Sea to England, and eventually south to the coasts of Francia and Iberia. These were not aimless wanderings, they were calculated entries into an established economy of violence. The Viking raids that had terrorized Christian Europe for 2 centuries had created, by the year 1000, a mature infrastructure of piracy. There were established targets, the river monasteries of England and Francia, the trading towns of the Baltic, the poorly defended coastlines where farmers could be surprised and their cattle driven to waiting ships. There were established methods, the fast approach, the overwhelming force, the rapid extraction, the strategic use of terror to discourage resistance. And there were established markets, the slave ports of the Baltic and the Mediterranean, the trading centers of the North Sea world, the courts of ambitious kings who would pay well for the services of experienced fighting men. Olaf learned this economy. He became fluent in it. The sagas credit him with raids in Sweden, in Denmark, in Finland, in the eastern Baltic lands, whose populations the Norse called Vindland and Iceland. Some of these raids were probably small, a ship or two, a coastal village stripped of its portable wealth, the kind of opportunistic predation that shaded into commerce when commerce was more profitable. Others were larger, more organized, more closely connected to the geopolitical struggles of the age. By 1009, when Olaf was roughly 14 or 15, the sources place him in England, fighting in the army of Thorkel the Tall. This was not a small raid. This was an invasion, one episode in the long Danish campaign to conquer the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that would culminate, a few years later, in the reign of Canute the Great. Thorkel was a Danish warlord of the first rank, commander of the Jomsvikings, the legendary mercenary brotherhood whose historical reality modern scholars still debate, and his army represented the state-of-the-art in early medieval military organization. What Olaf did in England, precisely, is difficult to recover. The sagas give him credit for various battles and sieges, including an attack on London Bridge that later legend would transform into the nursery rhyme, "London Bridge is falling down," though the connection is almost certainly apocryphal. What matters is the context. Olaf was learning war at the highest level his era could offer. He was fighting alongside professional warriors against a wealthy, organized Christian kingdom. He was seeing what centralized royal power looked like, how it fielded armies, how it collected taxes, how it built churches and administered justice. He was, in other words, getting an education in the kind of kingship he would later try to impose on Norway. And then, sometime around 1013 or 1014, according to the most likely reconstruction, he was baptized. The place was Rouen, in Normandy. The circumstances were political as much as spiritual. Olaf had entered the service of Richard II, Duke of Normandy, one of the most powerful lords in northern France, and a man whose own ancestors had been Vikings. The Normans were, after all, the Northmen, who had settled and Christianized and become something new. Richard was a useful patron. He had wealth, ships, connections to the wider Christian world, and he had, it seems, a condition for his patronage. Olaf must be baptized. We do not know what Olaf believed when he went down into the baptismal waters. The sources, written by Christians for Christian audiences, naturally present the conversion as sincere, even profound, a transformation of the soul, a turning from darkness to light. Modern historians are more cautious. Conversion in this era was often a political act, a condition of alliance, a price of admission to the Christian club of European kingship. Many converts maintained the old practices in private. Many understood baptism as adding a new god to their collection rather than renouncing the old ones. The line between sincere conversion and strategic accommodation was blurry, perhaps non-existent. What we can say is that Olaf, from this point forward, acted as a Christian. He would return to Norway claiming to rule in the name of Christ. He would build churches, appoint bishops, enforce Christian law. He would do so with a violence that shocked even his contemporaries, burning temples, mutilating those who refused to convert, executing chieftains who clung to the old ways. Whether this violence flowed from genuine religious zeal, from calculated political strategy, or from some mixture of the two that Olaf himself could not have disentangled, this is a question the sources pose but cannot answer. What they do record is that in 1015, roughly 20 years old, freshly baptized, hardened by a decade of raiding and warfare, Olaf Haraldsson sailed back to Norway with 2 ships, 200 men, and an ambition that would have seemed laughable to anyone who did not know what he was capable of. He intended to conquer the country. The Norway that Olaf returned to in 1015 was, in one sense, ripe for conquest. The previous 2 decades had seen a series of failed unification attempts, bloody civil wars, and most recently, the death of the man who had come closest to establishing lasting control. That man was Olaf Tryggvason, another Olaf, a man whose career had in many ways paralleled and prefigured the younger Olaf's. Olaf Tryggvason had also been a Viking raider, also been baptized abroad, also returned to Norway with ships and ambition and a determination to impose Christianity on the fractious Norwegian chieftains. He had ruled for 5 years, from 995 to 1000, and he had converted much of the coastal population at sword point, smashing idols, burning temples, forcing the old practices underground. He had also made enemies of the Danish and Swedish kings, and in the year 1000, at the sea battle of Svolder, those enemies had caught him. His fleet was destroyed, his body was never found. Norway fell back into fragmentation, parceled out among Danish overlords and local chieftains. Its brief experiment in centralized Christian kingship apparently ended. 15 years later, when Olaf Haraldsson arrived, the situation was both similar and different. Denmark was distracted. King Sweyn Forkbeard had died in 1014, and his son Kunut was focused on securing England, not on governing Norway. The chieftains who ruled in the Danes' name were unpopular, seen as foreign puppets. The infrastructure of Christianity that Olaf Tryggvason had begun to build was still present, if weakened. There were priests, there were churches, there were baptized Norwegians who remembered the old king and wondered if his work could be continued. And there was something else, something that the sources emphasize, even if they cannot fully explain. There was a hunger among some Norwegians for a king, not a foreign overlord, not a puppet of the Danes, not a coalition of bickering chieftains. A king, a single man who could unite the coastal regions and the inland valleys, who could protect Norwegian interests against Danish expansion, who could represent in his person the dignity of the Norwegian people. Olaf Haraldsson understood this hunger. He had, after all, grown up watching his stepfather Sigurd Syr practice the careful, limited, unambitious kingship of the old style. He had seen what that kingship could not do, could not project power beyond the local valleys, could not build lasting institutions, could not create anything that would outlast a single generation. And he had seen, in England and Normandy, what the new kingship could do. He had seen kings who built cathedrals and collected taxes and appointed bishops and wrote their will in law. He had seen the future, and he intended to bring it home. The conquest itself, as the sources describe it, was less a single campaign than a 2-year process of accumulation. Olaf began in the uplands, in the interior valleys where he had connections and where Danish power was weakest. He presented himself not as a foreign conqueror, but as a native son returning, a descendant of Harald Fairhair, a legitimate heir to the old unified kingship, a man who came to free Norway from Danish domination. The message resonated. Chieftains who had chafed under Danish rule began to defect. Farmers who remembered Olaf Tryggvason began to wonder if this new Olaf might finish what the old Olaf had started. By 1016, Olaf had enough support to risk a confrontation. At the sea battle of Nesjar, fought in the waters of the Oslo Fjord, he met the forces of the Danish-backed Earls and broke them. The victory was not total. The Earls escaped. The Danes did not abandon their claims, but it was decisive enough. In the aftermath of Nesjar, the remaining opposition collapsed. Chieftain after chieftain submitted, swore oaths, accepted Olaf as their king. By the end of 1016, Olaf Haraldsson controlled more of Norway than any ruler since Olaf Tryggvason, perhaps more than anyone since Harald Fairhair himself. He was 21 years old. He had been a Viking raider at 12, a warrior in the Danish invasion of England at 14, a baptized Christian at 18, and now, at 21, he was king of Norway. The reign that followed would last 15 years. It would transform the country, and it would end with the king standing on a hillside, watching his own people come to kill him. But before we can understand how it ended, we must understand what Olaf did with his 15 years of power. We must understand the revolution he attempted, the systematic, violent, uncompromising effort to remake Norway according to a new model of society. And we must understand why that revolution produced such hatred, such resistance, such a catastrophic backlash that the man who had conquered the country found himself, in the end, unable to hold it. The Christianity that Olaf Haraldsson brought to Norway was not a gentle faith. It was not a message of peace and love and universal brotherhood, or rather, it was not only that. It was also a comprehensive system of social organization, a set of laws and institutions and hierarchies that touched every aspect of human life. To become Christian in early 11th century Scandinavia was not simply to accept a new set of beliefs about the nature of the divine. It was to accept a new calendar, marking time by the feasts of saints rather than the rhythms of the agricultural year. It was to accept new dietary restrictions, fasting on appointed days, abstaining from horse meat and other foods associated with the old sacrifices. It was to accept new sexual regulations, monogamy, restrictions on divorce, prohibitions against the flexible marital arrangements that had characterized Norse society. It was to accept new forms of authority, bishops who answered to Rome, priests who claimed powers no local chieftain could match, a church that demanded tithes and obedience and placed itself above the old thing assemblies. This was what Olaf intended to impose, and he did not intend to impose it gradually. The methods he used were simple and brutal. He traveled from district to district with his armed retinue. He summoned the local chieftains and farmers to assemblies. He demanded that they accept baptism, destroy their idols, abandon the old sacrifices. Those who refused were punished, and the punishments were designed to be memorable. The sagas record chieftains who were blinded, their eyes put out so they could never again see the sacred groves. They record farmers who were mutilated, their hands cut off for making the old offerings. They record executions, burnings, entire districts laid waste when the resistance was organized enough to require military suppression. We must be careful here. The sagas were written by Christians who had every reason to emphasize Olaf's role as a missionary, and some of the violence they describe may be exaggerated for hagiographic effect. The saint who was willing to use any means necessary to save souls from damnation. Modern historians disagree about how systematic the violence actually was. How much was royal policy and how much was local excess? How much was real and how much was literary convention? But even accounting for exaggeration, the picture that emerges is striking. This was not conversion by persuasion. This was conversion by terror. And the terror was not random. It was targeted at the institutions and practices that sustained the old religion. The temples were burned because temples were where the sacrifices happened. The chieftains were blinded because chieftains were the ones who led the rituals. The farmers were mutilated because farmers were the ones who maintained the sacred sites in their fields and forests. Olaf was not merely punishing resistance, he was systematically dismantling the infrastructure of a competing religious system. The old religion, what we now call Norse paganism, was not a unified church. It had no pope, no bishops, no creed, no scripture. It was a decentralized collection of practices, stories, and relationships with supernatural beings. Different regions emphasized different gods. Different families maintained different traditions. The rituals were embedded in the fabric of daily life, in the blessings spoken over planting and harvest, in the offerings made at sacred trees and stones, in the feasts that marked the turning of the seasons. This decentralization was both a strength and a weakness. It meant that there was no single point of failure, no king or priest whose conversion would bring down the whole system. But it also meant that there was no organized resistance. Each chieftain, each district, each family faced the Christian king's demands alone, and alone they were not strong enough to refuse. Still, the resistance was real, and it came from sources Olaf may not have anticipated. The chieftains resisted because they stood to lose power. The old religious rituals had been one of their most important functions, and a Christianity mediated by priests and bishops would cut them out. The farmers resisted because they genuinely believed in the old gods, because they feared the consequences of abandoning the beings who had protected their ancestors, because the new Christian calendar and dietary laws and sexual regulations disrupted patterns of life that had worked for generations. And the Danes were watching. King Canute, by 1016, had consolidated his hold on England. He had not forgotten Norway. He had not forgotten the chieftains who had lost their positions when Olaf took power, the earls who had fled after Nesjar, the network of Norwegian magnates who would have preferred any king to this violent religious revolutionary. For the moment, Canute was too busy with England to intervene directly, but he maintained contacts. He offered asylum to Olaf's enemies. He waited. Olaf, for his part, was not idle. He was building. He was establishing the institutions of Christian kingship as fast as circumstances would allow. He appointed bishops, men trained abroad in England and Germany, who brought with them the organizational techniques and liturgical practices of the wider Christian church. He built churches, wooden structures at first, modest by continental standards, but visible signs of the new dispensation. He issued laws, the Olaf's Law, as later tradition would call it, though how much of the surviving text actually dates to Olaf's reign is disputed. He collected taxes, tried to establish regular administration, worked to replace the personal bonds of chieftain and follower with the impersonal bonds of subject and king. The project was incomplete. It could not have been otherwise. Olaf had 15 years, and he was trying to accomplish what would take Scandinavian societies 3 or 4 generations. The bishops he appointed depended on his military support. When that support was withdrawn, their authority would collapse. The churches he built could be burned. The laws he issued could be ignored once he was gone. He was building on sand, and he seems to have known it. The urgency of his methods, the violence of his enforcement, may have reflected his understanding that he was racing against time, that he had to root Christianity so deep that his enemies could not tear it out, that he had to break the old system so thoroughly that there would be nothing left to restore. Whether this was genuine religious conviction, political calculation, or some amalgam of the two, the effect was the same. By the mid-1020s, after nearly a decade of Olaf's rule, Norway was more Christian than it had ever been. The temples were gone or hidden. The public sacrifices had stopped. The new faith was the only faith that could be practiced openly. And Norway hated him. The hatred was not universal, but it was widespread, and it crossed lines that Olaf had not expected. The chieftains hated him because he had stripped them of power. The old aristocratic families hated him because he had elevated new men, his own followers, his household warriors, men whose only claim to authority was their loyalty to the king. The farmers hated him because of the violence, yes, but also because of the taxes, the new obligations, the endless demands of a state apparatus that seemed designed to extract rather than to protect. And the Danes were still waiting. In 1028, they moved. Canute, now secure in England and Denmark, turned his attention to Norway. He did not invade with a fleet, not immediately. He did something more effective. He bought the rebellion. He sent money to the disaffected chieftains. He promised them restoration of their old privileges. He offered asylum to anyone who would turn against Olaf. And one by one, district by district, the magnates of Norway switched sides. It happened faster than anyone could have predicted. Within months, Olaf's position had become untenable. The coastal regions, which had always been most connected to Denmark by trade and kinship, declared for Canute. The inland valleys, where Olaf's base had been strongest, began to waver. The king, who had seemed invincible, who had broken every opponent, who had bent the entire country to his will, suddenly found himself without support. In the winter of 1028 to 1029, Olaf Haraldsson fled Norway. He went east into Sweden and then further east into the lands of the Rus. He came to the court of Yaroslav the Wise, the Prince of Novgorod, and later of Kiev, whose wife Ingigerd was a Swedish princess Olaf had once hoped to marry. He was in exile now, a king without a kingdom, a man whose life's work had collapsed in a matter of months. He stayed in Rus for roughly a year. All what he did there, what he thought, how he processed the catastrophe. The sources give us only glimpses. He seems to have maintained contact with supporters in Norway. He seems to have believed that Knut's hold on the country was fragile, that the chieftains who had betrayed him would turn again if they had a credible alternative. He seems to have planned, from the beginning, to return. And in the spring of 1030, he did. He came back the way he had first come to Norway, with a small force, counting on momentum to build support. But the circumstances had changed. This was not 1015, when Denmark was distracted and the chieftains were looking for a native king. This was 1030, when the chieftains had made their choice and were determined to defend it. Olaf gathered what forces he could: Rus mercenaries, Swedish volunteers, Norwegian exiles who had followed him east, farmers from the inland valleys who still believed in his cause. By the time he crossed the mountains into Trøndelag, the heartland of central Norway, he had perhaps 3,000 men. The army that came to meet him had at least 3 times that number. They were led by the chieftains he had stripped of power, by the magnates he had humiliated, by the men whose fathers and brothers he had blinded and mutilated in the name of Christ. They had gathered from across the country, coastal lords, inland farmers, even some of the same men who had sworn oaths to Olaf a decade before. They had one purpose: to kill the king who had tried to make them something they did not want to be. And so, on July 29th, 1030, on a hillside called Stiklestad, the two armies met. The light was wrong. Modern astronomers have confirmed that a partial solar eclipse was visible from central Norway that day. Not totality, not full darkness, but a dimming, a graying, an unmistakable strangeness in the sky. The men on both sides would have seen it. They would have wondered what it meant. Olaf's army was outnumbered, outflanked, exhausted from the mountain crossing. The battle was brief. By the standards of the age, it was not particularly bloody, perhaps a few hundred dead on each side, far fewer than the great battles of the Continental Wars. But among the dead by nightfall was the king. The sources disagree about the details. They agree that Olaf was wounded, probably 3 times, a spear in the belly, a sword cut to the knee, an axe blow to the neck that finished him. They agree that he died still fighting, still standing, still king. And they agree that the men who killed him were Norwegians, farmers, and chieftains who had decided that this man, this violent Christian revolutionary, this hammer of the old gods and scourge of the old ways, had to die. They had won. The king was dead. Norway was free of him at last. And then, the very next day, the miracles began. The body lay where it had fallen, near the crest of the hill, among the trampled grass and the summer wildflowers crushed by 1,000 feet. The eclipse had passed. The sky had returned to its ordinary brightness, the long northern twilight of late July. The victors moved across the field, stripping the dead of weapons and jewelry, looking for men they knew among the fallen. Someone found the king. He was recognizable. The broad shoulders, the reddish-brown hair matted now with blood, the gold arm ring he had worn through exile and return. They carried him down from the hillside. They brought him to a farmstead, perhaps, or to a boat landing. The sources are not clear. What they did with the body in those first hours is uncertain. What matters is what happened next. A blind man touched the king's blood. He could see. That is the claim. A man who had been blind, congenitally or from disease or from injury, came into contact with the blood that had pooled beneath Olaf's wounds, and his sight was restored. It happened the day after the battle. It happened before the body was cold. It happened, according to the tradition, before anyone had decided what to do with the corpse of the defeated king. We cannot verify this. We cannot know if it happened or if it was invented later or if it was a coincidence reinterpreted after the fact. But we can know that people believed it happened. We can know that the belief spread. We can know that within days or weeks of Stiklestad, while the chieftains were still celebrating their victory and Knut's agents were still consolidating control, the story was circulating. The dead king had healed the blind, and the dead king's body would not decay. This detail appears in multiple sources. Olaf's corpse, unlike other corpses, did not rot. It did not smell. It did not bloat and collapse the way flesh ordinarily collapses when the spirit has departed. The skin remained whole. The wounds, perhaps, seemed to heal themselves. When the body was eventually exhumed, roughly a year after the battle, the witnesses reported that it was incorrupt, that the hair and nails had continued to grow, that the face still looked like the face of a man sleeping rather than a man dead. Incorruptibility was not a new concept. The Christian tradition had long associated the preservation of bodily remains with sanctity. The bodies of martyrs and confessors, according to hagiographic tradition, sometimes resisted the ordinary processes of decay as a sign of divine favor, a visible mark of grace. But Norway in 1030 was not Rome or Constantinople or even Rouen. The concept of sainthood, of relics, of miracles emanating from holy remains, this was foreign knowledge, imported theology, ideas that had been in the country for only a generation. The people who first noticed Olaf's incorruptibility may not have fully understood the framework into which it fit. They only knew that this was wrong, wrong in the sense of unnatural, wrong in the sense of significant, wrong in the sense that it demanded interpretation. The chieftains who had killed him faced a problem. They had expected, reasonably, that killing the king would end the king, that his supporters would scatter, his cause would die, his memory would fade into the long list of failed rulers and forgotten claimants that littered Scandinavian history. They had expected that Norway would return to the old arrangement, regional powers, competing claims, the worship that each family preferred in its own hall. They had expected victory. What they got was a corpse that would not cooperate. The miracles multiplied. The blind man was first, but he was not last. The sick came and were healed. The crippled came and walked. Mothers brought children with fevers, with seizures, with wasting diseases that no one could name. They touched the king's blood. They touched cloths that had touched the body. They prayed to the man they had watched die, the man their husbands and fathers had helped to kill, and they reported cures. Not all of them, surely. Not every supplicant went away satisfied. But enough. Enough that the stories spread. Enough that by the autumn of 1030, by the time the first snows fell on the battlefield, where the grass had grown back over the bloodstains, Olaf Haraldsson was no longer merely a dead king. He was becoming something else. Knut's representatives in Norway attempted to suppress the cult. They had to. The veneration of Olaf was not just a religious phenomenon. It was a political challenge. Every miracle attributed to the dead king was an implicit condemnation of those who had killed him. Every healing was a verdict. The chieftains who had gathered at Stiklestad, who had cut down the king with spear and sword and axe, who had stood over his body in the fading eclipse light and believed they had won, they were now, in the eyes of a growing number of Norwegians, the murderers of a saint. Their victory was becoming their indictment. Knut had placed Norway under the rule of his teenage son Svein and the boy's mother Elfgifu of Northampton, an English noblewoman of obscure but ambitious family. They governed harshly. They imposed taxes that the Norwegians found excessive. They enforced laws that the Norwegians found alien. They treated the country not as a kingdom to be nurtured, but as a conquest to be exploited. And they made a critical error. They tried to compete with a dead man. The miracles could not be stopped. The body could not be hidden. The stories could not be unspoken. Within a year of Stiklestad, perhaps sooner, even the church was beginning to acknowledge what the popular cult had already decided. Grimkel, the bishop whom Olaf had brought from England to help Christianize Norway, the same bishop who had helped draft the laws and build the churches and break the old altars, took a remarkable step. He declared Olaf a saint. This was irregular. The formal process of canonization, the papal investigation, the verification of miracles, the solemn proclamation, did not yet exist in the form it would later take. In the 11th century, the recognition of saints was still partly local, partly episcopal, partly a matter of popular acclaim confirmed by ecclesiastical authority. Grimkel had that authority. He had known Olaf personally. He had worked beside him. He had watched the king pray and confess and receive communion. And now he had heard the miracle reports, had perhaps witnessed some himself, had certainly seen the body that would not decay. He made the decision. On August 3rd, 1031, 1 year and 5 days after the battle, Olaf's body was translated to the main church in Nidaros, the town we now call Trondheim, and placed above the high altar. He was declared holy. He was declared a martyr. He was declared, though the word itself would not be used for centuries, the eternal king of Norway. The chieftains who had killed him must have watched this happen with something between disbelief and horror. Everything they had fought for was dissolving. The king they had killed was more powerful dead than he had ever been alive. His cult was spreading not despite his violent career, but because of it, because his violence had been for Christ, because his cruelty had been holy cruelty, because the blood on his hands was the blood of pagans and traitors and enemies of God. The same qualities that had made him intolerable as a ruler, his rigidity, his righteousness, his refusal to compromise, now made him irresistible as a saint. He had been a tyrant, now he was a martyr. He had been hated, now he was holy. And his body, his incorruptible, miracle-working body, was still there in the church at Nidaros, visible proof that the chieftains had made a terrible mistake. Within 3 years of the battle, Svein and Elfgifu were gone. The Norwegians had rebelled, not in the name of independence exactly, but in the name of Olaf. They invited his son Magnus, a boy who had been in exile with his father, who had been left behind in Rus when Olaf marched to Stiklestad, to return and take the throne. Magnus was 11 years old. He came anyway. He arrived in Norway in 1035, 5 years after his father's death, and he was acclaimed king by the same chieftains, or their sons, who had destroyed his father. He ruled for 12 years. He was called Magnus the Good. And his legitimacy rested entirely on the sanctity of the man who had been cut down on that hillside. This is the paradox we named at the beginning. A king who failed in life succeeded in death. A ruler whom his own people rejected became the ruler they could never escape. Olaf Haraldsson spent 15 years trying to make Norway Christian by force, and he was killed for it. Olaf Haraldsson spent the next 1,000 years making Norway Christian from beyond the grave. But to understand what that means, to understand how a dead king could reshape a kingdom more profoundly than a living one, we have to understand what medieval people believed about saints and relics, about the holy dead and their continuing presence in the world. The theology of relics is alien to most modern minds. We think of death as an ending, of corpses as objects, of the dead as absent. Medieval Christians thought differently. For them, the saints were not gone. The saints were present, more present in some ways than the living. They existed simultaneously in heaven, where they interceded with God on behalf of the faithful, and on earth in their relics, where they continued to act. A saint's body was not a memorial. It was a locus of power. It was the point where the divine touched the material, where heaven intersected earth, where miracles could happen, because holiness was physically concentrated in the bones and blood and incorruptible flesh of the holy dead. To possess the relics of a saint was to possess a piece of heaven. To have a saint's body in your church was to have an intercessor in your city, a protector against disease and disaster and enemy attack. The great churches of medieval Europe competed fiercely for relics, buying them, stealing them, inventing them when no genuine article could be found. The bones of apostles and martyrs were divided and subdivided, distributed across Christendom in tiny fragments, each fragment carrying the full power of the whole. A splinter of the true cross could heal the sick. A vial of a martyr's blood could guarantee victory in battle. The skull of a virgin could protect a city from plague. Norway, before Olaf, had no major saints. The country had been Christian for only a generation. It had no martyrs, no confessors, no holy bodies around which a cult could form. The sacred geography of Christendom, the pilgrimage routes to Rome and Jerusalem and Compostela, the great shrines of France and Germany and England, all of that was distant, foreign, accessible only to those with the wealth and time to travel. Norwegian Christianity was thin, recent, dependent on foreign bishops and imported ideas. It lacked what every healthy religious culture needs, a local holy dead. Olaf changed that. His body in the church at Nidaros became what Rome had in Peter, what Canterbury would have in Thomas, what Compostela had in James. It became a center. Pilgrims came, at first from Norway itself, then from across Scandinavia, eventually from as far as Iceland and the Faroes and even England. They came to touch the shrine, to pray before the relics, to be healed of diseases and forgiven of sins and strengthened for the difficulties of their lives. They left offerings. They left silver and gold and land and livestock. They made Nidaros rich. They made the church that held Olaf's body one of the wealthiest and most powerful institutions in the Nordic world. The economics of sanctity are easy to overlook, but they mattered. A shrine needed clergy to tend it, guards to protect it, buildings to house it, ceremonies to honor it. All of this cost money. The money came from pilgrims and from the piety of kings and magnates who wanted to associate themselves with the holy dead. The shrine of St. Olaf generated revenue for centuries. It funded the construction of Nidaros Cathedral, one of the northernmost great churches of medieval Christendom. It supported an archbishopric that would eventually claim jurisdiction over all of Scandinavia, including Iceland, Greenland, and the Norse settlements in the North Atlantic. The dead king built an institution that outlasted every living king who followed him. But the power was not only economic, it was political in the deepest sense. Olaf's sanctity transformed what it meant to be king of Norway. Before Olaf, Norwegian kingship was contested, fragmented, dependent on the personal power of whoever could seize and hold the throne. The country had no stable dynasty, no clear rules of succession, no ideology that made one claimant more legitimate than another. After Olaf, Norwegian kingship was, in theory, in aspiration, in the stories that kings told about themselves, sacred. The king was not merely a ruler, he was the heir of a saint, the guardian of holy relics, the representative on earth of the eternal king who sat enthroned in heaven. To rebel against the king was to rebel against Saint Olaf. To threaten the kingdom was to threaten the faith. This ideology took time to develop fully. It was not articulated in 1031 or even in 1050. It emerged gradually, over generations, as the cult of Saint Olaf became embedded in the fabric of Norwegian society. But its roots were there from the beginning, in the first miracles, in the first translations, in the decision to place the incorruptible body above the altar and declare that this man, this violent Christian revolutionary, this king whom his own people had killed, was holy. The chieftains who had gathered at Stiklestad thought they were ending something. They were starting something that would last a millennium. Consider what happened to the men who killed him. The sources record their names, some of them. Thorir Hund, a chieftain from the north who had been one of Olaf's most bitter enemies. Kalv Arnason, who had once been Olaf's ally and had turned against him. Others whose names have been preserved in tradition or chronicle. They were victorious. They had won the battle. They had killed the king. And within a few years they were, what? Forgotten? Forgiven? Transformed into villains in the stories that their own grandchildren told, the sagas are not kind to the men of Stiklestad. They are portrayed as traitors, as dupes of Danish manipulation, as men who killed a saint and lived to regret it. Thorir Hund, according to later tradition, went on pilgrimage to Jerusalem to atone for his role in the battle. He was said to have touched his spearhead, the spearhead that had wounded Olaf, to a holy relic in Constantinople, and the blade had turned red with the saint's blood still fresh after all those years. Whether this story is true, or even whether it was told in Thorir's own lifetime, is impossible to know. What matters is that it was told eventually. The killers of Saint Olaf could not escape his sanctity. They were conscripted into his legend, made to serve as witnesses to his holiness even in their opposition. This is what the cult of saints did. It reinterpreted the past. It took the messy, ambiguous, morally complicated events of history and gave them shape, gave them meaning, gave them a direction that pointed toward heaven. Olaf's violent reign became his martyrdom's prelude. His cruelty became zeal. His failure became triumph. The eclipse that had darkened the sky over Stiklestad became a cosmic sign, the heavens themselves mourning the death of the holy king. Everything that had happened was reread in light of what came after, and what came after was sanctity. The body lay in Nidaros for centuries. It was translated multiple times, moved to grander shrines as the cathedral grew around it. It became the center of a cult that shaped Scandinavian Christianity, that drew pilgrims from across the known world, that generated enough wealth and power to make the archbishops of Nidaros major political figures in their own right. The Feast of St. Olaf, July the 29th, the anniversary of Stiklestad, became one of the great festivals of the Scandinavian calendar. In Iceland, it was called Olafsök, and it marked the division between summer and autumn. In Norway, it was the day when the nation remembered its eternal king. And then the Reformation came, and everything changed. But that is a later part of the story. For now, in the years immediately after Stiklestad, we must stay with the phenomenon as it was first experienced, the strange, unsettling, politically inconvenient miracle of a king who refused to stay dead. The men who had killed him tried to move on. They installed their Danish-backed regime. They collected their taxes. They enforced their laws. And every day, in the church at Nidaros, the body lay incorrupt, and the pilgrims came, and the miracles were reported, and the dead king's reputation grew. The living rulers could build armies and forge alliances and pass decrees. The dead king could heal the blind. It was not a fair contest. It had never been a fair contest. The chieftains had defeated a man. They had not defeated a symbol. They had not defeated a story. They had not defeated the idea that their own violence, their own victory, their own moment of triumph on the hillside at Stiklestad had been, all along, without their knowing it, the creation of a saint. He had been difficult. He had been brutal. He had been inflexible and righteous and impossible to live with. And now he was holy, and they were not. And the same rigidity that had made him intolerable in life made him irresistible in death. He had been right. That was the message of the miracles. That was the meaning of the incorruption. The king they killed had been right, and they had been wrong, and no amount of Danish silver or political maneuvering could change that verdict. Within 5 years, Magnus was on the throne. Within a generation, Olaf's cult was the foundation of Norwegian royal ideology. Within a century, his feast day was celebrated across Scandinavia. Within 2 centuries, his shrine at Nidaros was one of the great pilgrimage destinations of Northern Europe, rivaling in regional importance what Canterbury and Compostela were for England and Spain. The farmers who had cut him down at Stiklestad had thought they were defending their old ways, their old gods, their old freedoms. They had been defending nothing. They had been building a church. The church they built rose in increments. Stone upon stone, decade upon decade, until the great cathedral at Nidaros stood over the place where Olaf's body had first been interred, a physical monument to the transformation of a violent king into an eternal saint. But the architectural achievement, impressive as it became, was only the visible expression of something more profound. The true construction was ideological. It was the building of a kingdom around a corpse. To understand what happened in the decades after Stiklestad, we must understand what Norway was before Olaf and what it became because of him. The land we now call Norway was not, in the early 11th century, a unified nation in any modern sense. It was a collection of regions, each with its own traditions, its own power structures, its own relationship to the kings who claimed sovereignty over them. The Trøndelag in the center, the Vestland along the western fjords, the Oppland in the interior, the Viking in the south, these were not provinces of a coherent state. They were semi-autonomous territories whose loyalty to any particular king was contingent, negotiable, and often temporary. A king might rule the whole for a season. He might be driven out the next. The jarls and chieftains who controlled the local thing, assemblies held the real power, and any king who forgot this did so at his peril. Olaf had forgotten it, or rather, he had refused to accept it. His vision of kingship was not the first among equals model that Norwegian tradition demanded. It was something closer to the Christian monarchies he had observed in Normandy and England, centralized, divinely sanctioned, answerable to no earthly power except perhaps the church that had anointed him. He had tried to impose this vision by force. He had failed. The coalition of chieftains and the Danish-backed Sonat had driven him out, and then they had killed him. That should have been the end. In any ordinary political calculation, it would have been the end. But the cult changed the calculation. Within a decade of Stiklestad, the political situation had shifted dramatically. Enot's son Svein, the puppet king installed to rule Norway, had proven deeply unpopular. His mother, Elfgifu, known in Norse sources as Alfifa, had governed with a heavy hand, imposing taxes and regulations that the chieftains found intolerable. The same men who had killed Olaf now found themselves chafing under a regime that was, in its own way, just as intrusive as his had been. And as their dissatisfaction grew, they remembered, or were encouraged to remember, that there was an alternative. Magnus, Olaf's illegitimate son, was still alive. He had been sent to the court of Yaroslav the Wise in Rus when his father went into exile, and he had remained there after Stiklestad, growing up in safety while events unfolded in Norway. He was young. He was untested. He had no power base of his own and no obvious means of returning to claim a throne he had never held. But he had something more valuable than any of these practical advantages. He had a father who was becoming a saint. The chieftains who had opposed Olaf, or at least their sons and political heirs, now found it convenient to embrace his memory. They had not, they insisted, opposed the Holy King himself. They had opposed his advisors, his policies, his methods. They had been misled. They had not understood. And now, with the miracles multiplying and the cult spreading and the popular veneration growing stronger every year, they saw which way the wind was blowing. In 1035, a delegation of Norwegian chieftains traveled to Rusas and offered the crown to 11-year-old Magnus. This was, by any reasonable analysis, extraordinary. These were the men who had killed the boy's father. They had stood on the hillside at Stiklestad and watched their allies cut down Olaf Haraldsson. They had celebrated his death as a liberation. And now, barely half a decade later, they were traveling 1,000 miles to fetch his son and place him on the throne. The cult made this possible. It provided a framework for reconciliation. The chieftains had opposed Olaf the man, but they could venerate Olaf the saint. The dead king's holiness retrospectively legitimized his cause while simultaneously forgiving his killers. After all, if Olaf's death had been a martyrdom, if his suffering had been redemptive, then his killers had been instruments of divine providence, tragic figures who had unwittingly participated in the making of a saint. They were not murderers. They were not traitors. They were the men who had created the conditions for a miracle. This theological sleight of hand was essential to the political settlement that followed. Magnus returned to Norway and was acclaimed king. The Danish-backed regime collapsed, and the men who had killed his father became the men who had made his father holy. It was elegant, it was cynical, it was probably inevitable, given the way that cults of saints functioned in medieval political culture. The past could always be reread. The dead could always be rehabilitated. And the winners, whoever they happened to be at any given moment, could always claim that they had been on the right side all along. Magnus Olafsson, known to history as Magnus the Good, ruled Norway for 12 years. His reign was largely successful. He expanded Norwegian power, fought wars against the Danes and Wends, and eventually acquired the Danish throne itself when Knut's line failed. He was, by the standards of his time, an effective and relatively just king. But his most important political act may have been the one that happened earliest and cost him nothing. He became the son of a saint. Everything else followed from this. Magnus's legitimacy was not derived from conquest or from the consent of the chieftains who had invited him back. It was derived from his father's holiness. He was the son of Saint Olaf. He ruled by grace of God, which had manifested itself through the miracles at his father's tomb. The Norwegian kingdom was no longer a collection of semi-autonomous regions held together by force and negotiation. It was, at least in theory, a sacred monarchy, whose authority flowed from heaven through the body of the eternal king. This was new. This was revolutionary. This was exactly what Olaf himself had tried and failed to accomplish in life. He had wanted to be a Christian king on the continental model. He had wanted divine sanction for his rule. He had wanted a church that would support the crown and a crown that would protect the church. He had been driven out and killed because the chieftains would not accept this vision. And now, through the cult, the vision triumphed anyway. The irony was exquisite. The farmers at Stiklestad had fought, at least in part, to preserve their traditional freedoms against a centralizing Christian king. They had won the battle. They had lost the war. Within a generation, the king they killed had been sanctified. His son was on the throne, and the ideological foundation for everything they had opposed was being laid in stone at Nidaros. The church they built, literally and figuratively, would stand for 500 years, until the Reformation finally dismantled the Catholic structures that had grown up around Olaf's cult. And even then, even after the Protestants stripped the shrines and burned the relics and condemned the veneration of saints as popish idolatry, Olaf remained the eternal king. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. The later centuries will have their place. For now, we must stay with the phenomenon in its first flowering, the decades after Stiklestad, when the cult was still new, still contested, still finding its shape. The miracles continued. The sources record dozens of them, though the full extent of the hagiographic tradition is difficult to reconstruct. The earliest Vita of Olaf, the life written to commemorate and celebrate his sanctity, was composed within a generation of his death, though it survives only in fragments. The most comprehensive account we have comes from Snorri Sturluson's Heimskringla, written in the 13th century, nearly 200 years after the events it describes. Snorri was working from earlier sources, some of which may have been quite reliable, but he was also working within a tradition that had already made its interpretive choices. By his time, Olaf's sanctity was settled fact, and the miracles were established components of the legend. The types of miracles attributed to Olaf were standard for the genre. Healing miracles predominated: the blind who received sight, the lame who walked, the sick who recovered. There were also miracles of protection in which invoking Olaf's name saved the faithful from storms, fires, shipwrecks, or enemies. And there were miracles of punishment in which those who disrespected the saint or doubted his power suffered appropriate consequences. A man who scoffed at the stories found himself struck dumb. A thief who stole from the church was afflicted with a wasting disease. A Danish invader who threatened the shrine was visited by a dream in which Olaf himself appeared and warned him of the consequences. These narratives served multiple purposes. They demonstrated Olaf's power, which was essential to the cult's appeal. They encouraged veneration, which was essential to the church's revenues. And they reinforced the political message that had become inseparable from the religious one, that Olaf was Norway's protector, that his sanctity extended over the whole kingdom, that to oppose his cult was to oppose the nation itself. This fusion of religious and political identity was Olaf's most enduring achievement, though he did not live to accomplish it himself. In life, he had tried to unite Norway by force. He had failed. In death, he united it through faith, or through the political utility of faith, which in medieval terms amounted to the same thing. The shrine at Nidaros became the symbolic center of Norwegian identity. Kings were crowned there, treaties were sworn there, the great feasts of the religious calendar were celebrated there. And pilgrims came year after year, century after century, to venerate the body of the eternal king and to receive whatever blessings or healings or graces he might be pleased to bestow. The geography mattered. Nidaros, modern Trondheim, was not the most obvious choice for a national center. It was remote, far to the north, cold and difficult to reach for much of the year. Oslo in the south would have been more accessible. Bergen on the western coast would have been better connected to the Atlantic trade routes. But Nidaros had the body, and the body, it turned out, was enough. The cathedral that grew around it became one of the great architectural projects of medieval Scandinavia. Construction began in earnest under King Olaf Kyrre in the late 11th century, and it continued in fits and starts for 300 years. The building that eventually emerged was a Romanesque and Gothic masterpiece, comparable in ambition to the great cathedrals of England and France. Its construction required not just money, but expertise, architects and masons and craftsmen who had to be imported from abroad, because Norway in the 11th and 12th centuries did not have the building traditions necessary to produce such a structure on its own. This was significant. The cathedral at Nidaros was not just a monument to Olaf, it was a statement of Norway's place in the wider Christian world. It said, "We are not barbarians, we are not recent converts still half pagan. We are part of Christendom. We have saints, we have shrines, we have architecture that can stand comparison with anything in Europe." The violence of the conversion, the axes and the torches and the mutilations, receded into the background. What remained was the cathedral. What remained was the saint. The Archbishopric of Nidaros was established in 1153, more than a century after Olaf's death. It was the culmination of a long process of ecclesiastical development that had begun with the first missionaries and accelerated under kings who saw the church as an ally in their centralizing projects. The Archbishop of Nidaros became one of the most powerful figures in Norwegian society, a spiritual lord with temporal authority, a political player whose support could make or break kings, and his authority derived ultimately from the body in the shrine. Without the cult, there would have been no archbishopric. Without the saint, there would have been no power. Magnus the Good died in 1047, without legitimate heirs. The throne passed eventually to Harald Hardrada, the Hard ruler, who was Olaf's half-brother. Harald was perhaps the last of the great Viking warriors, a man who had fought as a mercenary in the Byzantine Empire, who had survived battles from Kiev to Constantinople, who would die in 1066 trying to conquer England at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. He was fierce and ambitious and utterly ruthless. He was not by any measure a saint, but he was Olaf's kinsman, and that mattered. The Hardrada's claim to the throne was strengthened by his connection to the Holy King. He was not Olaf's son, that was Magnus, but he was Olaf's brother, and the aura of sanctity that surrounded the cult extended in attenuated form to the whole family. The dynasty that Olaf founded, or rather, the dynasty that the cult created around his memory, would rule Norway for generations. They would fight and scheme and murder each other in the usual manner of medieval royalty. But they would all, to one degree or another, draw their legitimacy from the body in the shrine at Nidaros. The farmers at Stiklestad had not known what they were doing. They could not have known. They had thought they were killing a king. They had been making a foundation. Consider the aftermath from their perspective, or from the perspective of their children and grandchildren who inherited both the consequences and the memories. Your father or your grandfather had stood on that hillside. He had raised his weapon against the king. He had participated, directly or indirectly, in the death of a man who now healed the blind and answered prayers. What did that make you? What did that mean for your family's place in the new order that was being built around the cult? Some families, presumably, found ways to distance themselves from the deed. Others embraced it, reinterpreting their ancestors' actions as unwitting service to divine providence. Still others may have quietly maintained their old beliefs, honoring the old gods in private while publicly conforming to the new faith. The sources do not tell us much about these individual struggles. They were not the concern of the saga writers and hagiographers who were interested in the grand narrative of sanctity and kingship, not in the small human accommodations that ordinary people made to survive in a changing world. But the accommodations happened. They had to happen. The entire population of 11th century Norway could not simply forget that they had rejected their king and then killed him. They had to find ways to live with what they had done, or what their communities had done, while simultaneously venerating the saint they had made. The cult provided a mechanism for this. Saints forgive. That is part of their function. The dead king who had been merciless in life became merciful in death, extending healing and protection even to those who had opposed him. This was not just theology, it was politics. A cult that demanded vengeance would have been useless for the reconciliation that the new regime required. A cult that offered forgiveness could bring even the killer's descendants into its fold. And so they came. Pilgrims from across Norway, from across Scandinavia, from across the North Sea and the Baltic. They came to pray at the shrine. They came to touch the relics. They came to be healed or blessed, or simply to participate in something larger than themselves. And among them, almost certainly, were the children and grandchildren of the men who had fought at Stiklestad. The cult absorbed them. The cult forgave them. The cult made them too into witnesses of the saints' glory. The darkness that had fallen over the battlefield, the eclipse that the sources describe in such memorable terms, became part of the legend. It had been a cosmic sign, the heavens themselves darkening at the moment of the Holy King's death. Modern astronomy has struggled with this detail. Some scholars have suggested that a partial solar eclipse may have been visible in Norway around the time of the battle, though the timing and location do not match perfectly with any known eclipse. Others have proposed that the darkness was metaphorical, or that it referred to atmospheric conditions such as heavy cloud cover or smoke from fires. Still others have accepted it as a miraculous intervention, which would, of course, be immune to astronomical verification. What matters perhaps is not whether the darkness was literal, but what it meant. In the hagiographic tradition, eclipses and other celestial phenomena often accompanied the deaths of saints and holy men. The darkness at Stiklestad placed Olaf in this tradition, connecting his death to the cosmic drama that the medieval imagination saw playing out between heaven and hell. The sun had mourned the king. The creation itself had borne witness to his martyrdom. This was the story that triumphed. Not the story of a harsh king who had overreached and been punished for his arrogance. Not the story of farmers defending their ancient liberties against an intolerant zealot. Not the story of a political calculation gone wrong, of a man who had gambled on one more battle and lost. The story that triumphed was the story of the saint. And once that story took hold, everything else had to be reinterpreted in its light. The cruelty became zeal. The arrogance became righteousness. The failure became martyrdom. The death became triumph. The eclipse became a cosmic sign. And the body lay incorrupt in its shrine, year after year, century after century, while the kingdom that had rejected the living king built itself around the memory of the dead one. The shrine grew. That is the simplest way to describe what happened in the decades after Stiklestad. Though the word grew does not quite capture the organic quality of the process, the way it seemed to happen almost without deliberate direction, like a tree putting out roots and branches according to its own internal logic. The wooden church that housed Olaf's remains was rebuilt in stone. The stone church was expanded. The expanded church became insufficient for the crowds that gathered, and so plans were drawn for something grander still, a cathedral worthy of the saint who rested within it. Nidaros, the city we now call Trondheim, transformed itself around this sacred center. It became a pilgrimage destination of European significance, drawing the faithful from across the Christian world. English monks came, German merchants came, Icelandic poets came, Swedish nobles came to pray for the intercession of the saint whose earthly kingdom had once threatened their own. The traffic was not merely spiritual. Pilgrims needed lodging, food, supplies. They brought money and goods. They created demand for services. The shrine economy became a real economy, employing craftsmen and innkeepers and guides and all the subsidiary trades that cluster around any major human gathering place. The dead king had become, among other things, a source of revenue. But the shrine was only the visible apex of something much larger. Across Norway, in parishes and villages and remote farming communities, churches were being dedicated to St. Olaf. His feast day, July 29th, the anniversary of Stiklestad, became a major celebration marked by special masses and processions, and in many places, by fairs and markets that combined religious observance with commercial opportunity. His image appeared on church walls, carved in wood, painted on panels, woven into textiles. He was shown with the attributes of his martyrdom, the axe, the banner, sometimes the dragon of paganism crushed beneath his feet. He looked out from these images with the serene confidence of the triumphant dead, bearing no resemblance to the desperate wounded man who had actually fallen on that July day. This was intentional. The iconography was not interested in historical accuracy. It was interested in spiritual meaning. And the spiritual meaning required a figure of transcendent power, not a defeated king bleeding out in a farmyard. The transformation extended to the written record. Within a generation of Olaf's death, the first hagiographic accounts began to circulate. These were not biographies in any modern sense. They were collections of miracles, lists of wonders, testimonies to the saint's ongoing power. They drew on oral reports from pilgrims and clergy, on local traditions that had already begun to crystallize around the Stiklestad story, on the standard conventions of hagiographic literature that writers borrowed freely from one another across Christendom. A miracle attributed to one saint could easily migrate to another if it fit the narrative. A healing formula that worked for Martin of Tours could work equally well for Olaf of Norway. This was not plagiarism in the medieval understanding. It was participation in a genre, contribution to a shared repertoire of sacred narrative. The specific was less important than the typical. What mattered was not the individual story, but the pattern it revealed, the consistent evidence of sanctity, the reliable operation of divine power through the saint's intercession. The miracle accounts that survive paint a picture of Olaf as a particularly active and accessible saint. He healed the blind, as one would expect. He cured the lame and the leprous and the possessed, but he also intervened in more mundane matters. He helped sailors in storms. He protected travelers from robbers. He assisted women in difficult childbirth. He found lost objects, settled disputes, punished oathbreakers. He was, in short, a useful saint, one who could be called upon for the full range of human difficulties, not just the dramatic afflictions that required major miracles. This versatility was part of his appeal. You did not need to be dying to pray to Saint Olaf. You could pray to him about your crops, your cattle, your family quarrels, your business ventures. He was present in daily life, available for consultation, always listening. The liturgy that developed around his feast day reinforced this accessibility. The prayers and hymns composed for the celebration of July 29th presented Olaf as Norway's special advocate in heaven, a native son who had not forgotten his homeland even in glory. The texts played on the paradox of his death and triumph, on the darkness and the light, on the rejection and the vindication. They were often beautiful, in the formal, elevated way of medieval liturgical poetry. They were designed to be sung, and something of their power still comes through even in silent reading, even in translation, even across the gulf of 9 centuries. Light of the north, fallen and risen, slain by thy people, praying for thy people. The darkness covered thee, and the light returned. Perpetual King, pray for us. This is not an actual medieval hymn. I'm paraphrasing, compressing, trying to give you a sense of the register and tone. The real texts are longer, more intricate, bound by the technical requirements of Latin verse that do not survive translation. But the emotional core is accurate. Olaf was presented as simultaneously royal and pastoral, powerful and gentle, the victim and the victor. He belonged to Norway in a way that no living king could ever quite belong, because he was beyond politics now, beyond faction, beyond the compromises that earthly rule required. He was pure, he was eternal, he was theirs. The political utility of this cult was not lost on anyone. Olaf's son, Magnus, had already recognized it, using the saint's memory to legitimize his own reign and delegitimize his enemies. But the potential went far beyond any single succession dispute. A saint-king at the foundation of the dynasty meant that the dynasty itself partook of sanctity. The Norwegian monarchy was not merely a political arrangement, not merely a matter of power and inheritance and practical accommodation. It was divinely ordained. It had a saint's blood in its veins. To resist it was not just rebellion, but impiety. This argument would be deployed again and again over the following centuries, sometimes subtly, sometimes crudely, always with the same basic thrust. Olaf's sanctity sanctified the institution he had founded. The cult also served a more diffuse purpose in Norwegian identity formation. Before Olaf, there had been no Norway in any meaningful sense. Only a collection of regions, valleys, coastal communities, petty kingdoms that happened to share a language and certain cultural patterns. The process of unification had been brutal and incomplete. Olaf himself had contributed to that brutality, as had his predecessors, as would his successors. But the cult offered a different narrative, one in which Norwegian unity was not merely a political achievement wrung from resistant populations by force of arms, but a spiritual destiny, a sacred project blessed by heaven and vindicated by miracles. To be Norwegian was to belong to Olaf's people. To venerate the saint was to participate in a collective identity that transcended local attachments. This function became particularly important in the centuries after Olaf's death, as Norway's political independence ebbed and flowed. The kingdom would eventually enter into personal unions with Denmark and Sweden, losing much of its autonomy, governed by foreign monarchs who had little interest in Norwegian traditions. In these circumstances, the cult of Saint Olaf became a repository of national memory, a way of asserting distinctiveness even under foreign rule. The saint belonged to Norway, regardless of who sat on the throne in Copenhagen or Stockholm. His shrine at Nidaros remained Norwegian sacred space, a place where the country's identity could be renewed even when its sovereignty had lapsed. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In the immediate aftermath of Stiklestad in the 1030s and 1040s, the concern was not yet with distant constitutional arrangements or national identity in the modern sense. The concern was simpler and more urgent: how to make sense of what had happened, how to integrate the shock of the battle and its aftermath into a coherent understanding of God's will and Norway's future. The cult provided answers. Not philosophical answers, perhaps, not the kind of systematic theology that would satisfy a university professor, but practical, emotional, narrative answers. Answers that ordinary people could grasp and live with. Answers that turned chaos into meaning and guilt into grace. Among the most important of these answers was the idea that Olaf's death had been necessary. Not merely unfortunate, not merely explicable in terms of political miscalculation, but necessary, part of a divine plan that required the saint's blood to be shed for Norway's salvation. This was the martyrdom paradigm in its purest form. The death was not a defeat, but a sacrifice, a willing offering that accomplished something that could not have been accomplished by military victory. What exactly it accomplished varied in different tellings. In some versions, Olaf's death purchased Norway's final and complete conversion to Christianity, sealing with blood what had been attempted with legislation. In other versions, it established a spiritual covenant between heaven and the Norwegian people, a permanent bond that would endure even when earthly arrangements failed. In still others, it simply demonstrated God's mysterious wisdom, proving that apparent catastrophe could be the vehicle of divine glory. These interpretations were not mutually exclusive. A single believer might hold all of them simultaneously, emphasizing different aspects at different times. The flexibility was part of the cult's strength. It could accommodate many needs, many audiences, many moments in the ongoing negotiation between the sacred and the profane. The physical evidence of sanctity, the incorrupt body, the miraculous oil, the healings at the shrine, grounded these abstract ideas in tangible reality. You could touch the relics, you could see the pilgrims healed, you could smell the sweet fragrance that reportedly emanated from the saint's resting place. Whatever doubts you might have about theological formulations, the evidence of your senses confirmed that something extraordinary had occurred, that this dead king was not simply dead, but present, active, powerful in ways that ordinary corpses were not. The material culture of the cult, the shrines and reliquaries, the votive offerings and pilgrimage badges, the illuminated manuscripts and carved altarpieces, made the saint's presence visible and tangible in daily life. He was everywhere. He was always watching, always available, always ready to help or punish according to the behavior of those who invoked him. The punishment aspect should not be overlooked. Medieval saints were not merely benevolent, they were also dangerous. They could harm those who offended them, who broke oaths sworn in their name, who violated the peace of their sanctuaries, who showed disrespect to their relics. The miracle accounts include stories of such punishments: thieves struck blind, blasphemers afflicted with sudden illness, enemies of the church brought low by inexplicable misfortune. Saint Olaf, in particular, given his martial reputation in life, was credited with an active willingness to defend his honor and the honor of his church by force. He appeared in visions armed and armored, ready to strike. He was not a saint you wanted to cross. This combination of mercy and menace, of healing power and punitive potential, made the cult a significant force for social order. Oaths sworn on Olaf's relics carried special weight because the saint was understood to be actively interested in their fulfillment. Crimes committed in the vicinity of his shrine were considered especially heinous because they insulted his person. Disputes could be submitted to the saint's judgment through ordeals conducted at his altar, where the guilty party would presumably be exposed by some sign or affliction. The church that housed his relics was not merely a spiritual resource, but a center of legal and social authority, a place where the sacred and the secular interpenetrated in ways that modern categories cannot quite capture. The bishops of Nidaros, as custodians of the shrine, became figures of enormous power. They controlled access to the relics, they interpreted the miracles, they decided which claims of healing were authentic and which were fraudulent or exaggerated. They managed the flow of pilgrims and the disposition of offerings. They spoke, in some sense, for the saint himself, not claiming to channel his voice directly, but serving as his earthly representatives, the guardians of his legacy and the administrators of his ongoing ministry. This power had its corruptions, inevitably. There were disputes over money, over precedence, over the boundaries of episcopal authority. There were accusations of simony and nepotism and worldly ambition dressed in sacred garments. The church in medieval Norway was no different from the church elsewhere in Christendom, a mix of genuine piety and ordinary human vice, of spiritual aspiration and institutional self-interest. But even acknowledging these complications, the overall trajectory was clear. Olaf had become central to Norwegian Christianity in a way that no one could have predicted on the morning of July 29, 1030. The king who had failed to hold his kingdom in life had become its eternal sovereign in death. The man who had been driven into exile by his own people had become the focus of their devotion. The corpse that had been stripped and left in a farmyard had become the holiest object in the realm. This was not a small transformation. This was not a minor adjustment in reputation. This was a complete inversion, a reversal so total that it challenges our ordinary understanding of how historical memory works. The question of why it happened, why Olaf in particular, why Norway in particular, why this particular moment in the history of Scandinavian Christianity has occupied scholars for generations. The answers are necessarily speculative, involving as they do the unknowable inner lives of people dead for a millennium. But some factors seem relevant. First, there was the matter of timing. Olaf died at precisely the moment when Norway was ready for a national saint, but did not yet have one. Other Scandinavian kingdoms had their holy patrons. Denmark had Canute, killed by his own people in 1086 and quickly canonized. Sweden would eventually have Eric, another king saint with a martyr's death. England had Edmund and Edward the Confessor, and a whole calendar full of Anglo-Saxon holy men. Norway, coming late to Christianity, had no such figures. The religious calendar was full of foreign saints, Roman martyrs, Irish monks, continental abbots, whose connection to Norway was purely theological. A local saint, a Norwegian saint, a saint whose blood had been shed on Norwegian soil, filled a genuine need. Olaf arrived to fill it. Second, there was the manner of his death. He had been killed by his own people, by Norwegians, by farmers and chieftains who had rejected his rule. This created the paradox that made the cult so psychologically compelling. If he had been killed by foreign invaders, by Danes or Swedes or pagan raiders, the story would have been simpler, but less powerful. The guilt would have belonged to outsiders, and the cult would have been primarily a matter of resistance to external enemies. But the guilt belonged to Norwegians themselves. The cult therefore had to do the work of reconciliation, of transforming fratricide into martyrdom, of making the killers into witnesses, and eventually into venerators. This internal work was more demanding, but also more transformative. It bound the entire community into the cult's orbit. Third, there was Olaf's own character, or rather, the character attributed to him in memory. He was not a gentle figure. He had been harsh, violent, uncompromising. He had burned and mutilated and killed in the service of his religious vision. This might seem like an obstacle to sanctity, but in the context of 11th century Christianity, it was actually an asset. The church needed saints who could represent militant Christianity, who could model the forceful suppression of paganism and heresy, who could demonstrate that violence in the service of the faith was not merely permissible, but praiseworthy. Olaf fit this need perfectly. His cruelty became evidence of his zeal. His harshness became proof of his holiness. The same actions that had alienated his subjects in life became, when properly reframed, the marks of his sanctity. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, there were the miracles. Without the miracle reports, none of the rest would have mattered. A dead king might be remembered fondly or bitterly, might be celebrated or condemned, but he would not become a saint. Sanctity required evidence of divine favor, and the evidence had to be ongoing, had to continue generating itself year after year through new healings and wonders and interventions. The miracle accounts provided this evidence. They gave the cult a renewable resource, a constantly refreshed stream of testimonies that confirmed and reconfirmed the saint's power. Every new healing was proof that Olaf was still active, still listening, still capable of helping those who called upon him. The cult fed itself. It grew by its own momentum. The result, by the middle of the 11th century, was a transformation not just of Olaf's reputation, but of Norwegian society itself. The country that had killed its king now organized itself around his memory. The church that administered his cult became the dominant institution of the realm. The dynasty that claimed his blood became the legitimate rulers, their authority grounded not merely in force or custom, but in sacred inheritance. The calendar revolved around his feast day. The landscape filled with his churches. The law invoked his name. The art depicted his image. The poetry celebrated his glory. And somewhere beneath it all, buried under layers of hagiography and liturgy and political calculation, there was still a man. A real man who had lived and fought and prayed and suffered. A man who had stood on a hillside one July morning, watching the sun go dark, knowing he was going to die. A man who had believed, apparently sincerely, that what he was doing was right, that the cruelty was necessary, that the violence served God, that the kingdom he was building would endure. He had been wrong about the kingdom. It had collapsed within weeks of his death, conquered by the Danes he had spent his life fighting. But he had been right, in a way he could never have anticipated, about endurance. His memory endured, his cult endured, his transformation from failed king to eternal saint endured. The darkness at Stiklestad, whatever it actually was, eclipse or cloud or metaphor or miracle, became the central image of this transformation. In the darkness, the old Olaf died. The political actor, the military commander, the harsh evangelist who had overreached and paid the price. In the light that followed, the new Olaf was born. The saint, the intercessor, the perpetual king who would reign over Norwegian memory for 1,000 years. The darkness was necessary. That was the lesson the cult taught. Without the darkness, there could be no light. Without the death, there could be no resurrection. Without the defeat, there could be no triumph. The logic was theological, but it was also deeply human, a way of making sense of tragedy, of finding meaning in loss, of believing that the worst moments might contain the seeds of the best ones. Norway had killed its king. Norway would spend centuries proving that the killing had been part of a divine plan all along. The body itself became the proof. Not the memory of the body, not the idea of the body. The actual physical remains of Olaf Haraldsson, lying in their shrine at Nidaros, became the center around which the entire cult revolved, and this was not metaphorical. Medieval sanctity was an embodied thing, a matter of bones and hair and fingernails, of relics that could be touched and kissed and carried in procession through the streets. The saint was present in his remains. His power radiated outward from them like heat from a fire. To be near the relics was to be near the saint himself, still somehow alive, still somehow listening, still somehow capable of reaching across the barrier between the living and the dead to heal the sick and comfort the grieving and punish the wicked. The shrine at Nidaros became, in the decades after Olaf's death, one of the great pilgrimage destinations of Northern Europe. People came from across Scandinavia, from Iceland and the Faroes and the Orkneys, from England and Denmark and Sweden, to kneel before the silver casket that held the king's bones. They came seeking cures for ailments no physician could treat. They came seeking forgiveness for sins no priest could absolve. They came seeking miracles, and the miracle accounts suggest that many of them found what they were looking for, or at least believed they did, which in the economy of faith amounts to the same thing. The journey itself was part of the experience. Medieval pilgrimage was not tourism, it was penance made physical, devotion expressed through suffering, the soul's journey toward God enacted by the body's journey toward the saint. Pilgrims walked for weeks or months. They crossed mountains and fjords. They endured hunger and cold and exhaustion. They slept in fields and barns and pilgrim hostels. They carried staffs and wore badges. They traveled in groups for safety, singing hymns as they walked, reciting prayers, telling stories of the saint they were going to see. By the time they arrived at Nidaros, footsore and weary and desperate, they were prepared to believe. The shrine did not disappoint them. The cathedral that eventually rose around Olaf's relics, the great church of Nidaros, begun in the 12th century and built over generations, was itself a kind of theology in stone. Gothic arches reaching toward heaven, light falling through stained glass, the smell of incense and candle wax, the sound of chanting voices echoing off the vaulted ceiling. The shrine stood at the heart of all this, surrounded by silver and gold, by candles burning day and night, by offerings left by generations of the faithful. A blind man's staff, left after he received his sight, a crutch abandoned by a cripple who walked away whole, locks of hair, wax images of healed limbs, small coins and great treasures. The accumulated evidence of centuries of answered prayers. The church kept records. This was essential. The miracles had to be documented, witnessed, verified by reliable observers. Without documentation, a miracle was just a rumor. With documentation, it became evidence, evidence that could be cited in disputes, invoked in negotiations, presented to skeptics who demanded proof. The miracle registers at Nidaros grew thick with accounts. A woman from Bergen, blind from birth, who saw for the first time after touching the shrine. A fisherman from the north, his hand crushed by a falling mast, who woke the morning after praying to Olaf to find the bones healed and the pain gone. A child dying of fever, whose parents carried him to Nidaros in desperation and carried him home, laughing. The stories accumulated, each one adding to the weight of the whole, each one making the next one more plausible. The skeptic's response to such accounts is obvious. Many of these healings, perhaps most of them, can be explained without recourse to the supernatural. Psychosomatic illness resolves when the patient believes strongly enough in the cure. Diseases run their natural course, and recovery coincides by chance with the pilgrimage. Memory reshapes events, and the healing that actually took a month gets compressed in retrospect into a single miraculous moment. The desperate and the grieving are not reliable witnesses. The church had every incentive to collect and promote favorable accounts and to quietly forget the pilgrims who went home unhealed. All of this is true. It is also, in a sense, beside the point. The point is not whether the miracles actually happened in any modern evidentiary sense. The point is that people believed they happened and that this belief had consequences. The pilgrims who came to Nidaros experienced something. They walked away, changed, comforted if not cured, reassured if not healed, convinced that they had touched something holy even if their bodies remained broken. The community that formed around the shrine was real. The cathedral that rose from that community's offerings was real. The political power that flowed from controlling access to the saints' relics was real. The miracles were the foundation of all of it, the engine that drove the entire enterprise forward. Whether they were supernatural events or natural events interpreted through a supernatural framework is a question the medieval mind would not have recognized. To the pilgrims kneeling before the shrine, the distinction did not exist. God worked through nature. Nature expressed God's will. A healing that happened at the saint's shrine was a miracle because it happened at the saint's shrine. The location was the proof. The cult spread outward from Nidaros in concentric circles of influence. First the immediate region, then all of Norway, then Scandinavia, then the wider Christian world. Churches dedicated to Saint Olaf appeared across northern Europe. In London, 6 churches bore his name. In Novgorod, where the exiled king had once sheltered, a chapel commemorated his memory. In Iceland, which had accepted Christianity under pressure from Olaf's predecessor and consolidated the new faith during Olaf's reign, the cult took root so deeply that Olaf became a kind of secondary patron invoked alongside the Virgin and the Apostles. The arms of Norway came to feature his image, the king standing with his axe, the symbol of his martyrdom and of the violence that had defined both his life and his death. This is where we must pause to consider a theological problem that the medieval church largely avoided confronting directly, but that the modern observer cannot ignore. The axe. Olaf is depicted in countless churches and manuscripts and coins and seals holding an axe. The axe is his attribute, the visual marker that identifies him the way the keys identify Peter or the wheel identifies Catherine. It represents his martyrdom, the weapon that struck him down at Stiklestad. This is standard hagiographic iconography. Saints are identified by the instruments of their deaths. The axe is Olaf's cross, his gridiron, his arrows. But the axe also represents something else. The axe was not only the weapon that killed Olaf, it was also, according to the sagas, the weapon Olaf used to kill others. It was the tool of his forced conversions. It was what hacked the wooden idols to pieces, what hewed down the priests of the old gods, what threatened those who would not submit to baptism. When Olaf is shown holding an axe, we are seeing both the instrument of his martyrdom and the instrument of his ministry, and these are not, it turns out, so easy to separate. The same weapon, the violence received and the violence given. The saint as victim and the saint as perpetrator merged into a single image that the medieval church apparently found unproblematic, but that now reads as deeply strange. Here is a man venerated for his willingness to die for his faith, who is commemorated by the same tool he used to kill for his faith. The axe does not distinguish between these uses, neither, perhaps, did Olaf. This is the paradox at the heart of the cult. The more we examine it, the less comfortable it becomes. Consider, Olaf is venerated as a martyr, but he was not killed for refusing to renounce his faith. He was not killed by pagans seeking to stamp out Christianity. He was killed by Christians, his own subjects, many of them baptized, fighting under the banner of a Christian Danish king. Stiklestad was not a battle between Christ and Thor. It was a battle between 2 Christian armies, one of which happened to have a king who would later be declared a saint. The religious element of Olaf's death was ambiguous at best. He died fighting to recover a throne, not to defend a faith. Consider, Olaf is venerated as a builder of churches, but he was also a burner of temples, a destroyer of sacred sites, a king who demonstrated the superiority of the new religion by desecrating the holiest places of the old. The churches rose on the rubble of the Hofs. The cathedrals incorporated stones dragged from pagan shrines. The destruction and the construction were the same project, 2 aspects of a single transformative violence that remade the religious landscape of Norway. Is it possible to venerate the construction without also implicitly venerating the destruction? Consider, Olaf is venerated as a lawgiver. The Olav's Law, the Christian code that reshaped Norwegian society, is remembered as one of his great achievements. But what the Olav's Law actually contained in its earliest versions was a system of coercion that made religious conformity a legal requirement and prescribed brutal punishments for deviation. The mutilations, the blindings, the exile and confiscation of property, these were not incidental to the law. They were the mechanism by which the law functioned. To venerate Olaf as lawgiver is to venerate a system of religious enforcement that would, by modern standards, constitute persecution. The medieval church did not see these contradictions as contradictions. It saw them as coherence. The violence was holy violence. The coercion was loving coercion, the shepherd forcing his wayward sheep back to the flock. The destruction of pagan sites was not vandalism, but purification. The harsh punishments were not cruelty, but discipline. Everything Olaf had done, properly understood, expressed the same fundamental commitment, total dedication to God's cause, whatever the cost. This understanding of sanctity, sanctity as intensity, as completeness, as willingness to use any means necessary in the service of the faith, has a long history in Christianity. It is not unique to Olaf. It appears in the veneration of warrior saints, of crusader kings, of inquisitors and heresy hunters throughout the medieval period. There is an entire category of holiness that consists not of gentleness and mercy, but of zeal and severity. Olaf fit this category perfectly. His harshness was not a flaw to be explained away. It was a feature to be celebrated. But we are no longer medieval, and we can no longer see this quite so simply. What we can see from our vantage point is the machinery of sanctification in operation. We can see how a dead king became a living saint through a process that was simultaneously religious and political, spontaneous and manufactured, genuine and constructed. We can see how the cult served the interests of those who promoted it, the church that gained a powerful patron, the dynasty that gained sacred legitimacy, the nation that gained a unifying symbol. We can see how the miracle accounts functioned as a technology for producing belief, how the pilgrimage infrastructure concentrated wealth and influence at Nidaros, how the feast days and liturgies and dedications wove Olaf into the fabric of Norwegian life so thoroughly that imagining Norway without him became impossible. None of this means the cult was simply cynical, simply a manipulation of the credulous by the powerful. The distinction between genuine devotion and calculated promotion is not nearly so clear as we might like. The bishops who championed Olaf's cause may have believed sincerely that he was a saint. The pilgrims who reported miracles may have experienced something they genuinely could not explain. The kings who invoked his memory may have felt his presence as real, may have prayed to him with actual faith, may have believed that their authority really did flow from him through channels invisible but true. The medieval world did not separate the sacred and the political the way we do. Power was always already religious. Religion was always already political. A king could be a saint. A saint could legitimate a king. The categories interpenetrated. What the cult of Saint Olaf demonstrates more than anything is the flexibility of historical memory. The same life can be read in different ways depending on what the readers need it to mean. The harsh evangelist can become the loving pastor. The failed king can become the eternal sovereign. The man who alienated his subjects so thoroughly that they killed him can become the man those subjects venerate above all others. The transformation requires work, the work of hagiographers and liturgists, of bishops and kings, of pilgrims and miracle seekers, but it can be done. History is not fixed. It is constantly being remade in the image of the present's needs. The Norway that venerated Olaf was not the Norway that had killed him. Decades had passed, generations had turned over. The men who had fought at Stiklestad were dead. Their children's children were the ones building the shrine, organizing the pilgrimages, teaching their own children to revere the king their ancestors had slain. For them, the killing was not a memory but a story. It was something that had happened long ago, in a time before their time, perpetrated by people they had never known for reasons they did not entirely understand. What they knew was the saint. What they experienced was the cult. The living reality of Olaf's presence in their churches and calendars and prayers was more vivid, more immediate, more real than the distant violence of Stiklestad. This is how a nation makes peace with its past, not by confronting what happened, but by transforming it, by telling a story that incorporates the trauma and transmutes it into meaning. Norway had killed its king, but the killing had been part of God's plan. The death had been a martyrdom. The victim had been a saint. The sin had been redeemed. The guilt had been absorbed into a narrative that made the guilt itself evidence of divine providence. If Olaf had not died, he could not have become what he became. If Stiklestad had not happened, Norway would not have its patron, its protector, its perpetual king. The tragedy was necessary. That was the story the cult told. That was the story Norway learned to believe. The the physical landscape preserved the memory in stone and wood and silver. Every church dedicated to St. Olaf, and there were eventually more than 30 in Norway alone, with dozens more scattered across Scandinavia and beyond, was a monument not just to his holiness, but to the entire narrative that had produced his holiness. Every shrine, every altar, every relic, every image, hammered into metal or painted onto wood or carved into stone, represented an act of remembering that was also an act of interpretation. To build a church for St. Olaf was to affirm that he had been a saint, that his death had been a martyrdom, that his life had been holy, despite everything that might seem to contradict that holiness. The buildings were arguments made permanent. They shaped the way subsequent generations could think about the past, and the calendar shaped the way they experienced time itself. The Feast of St. Olaf, July 29th, the anniversary of Stiklestad, became one of the most important days in the Norwegian year. It was a holy day, a day of masses and processions, of fasting and feasting, of remembrance and celebration. On that day, every year, Norway paused to remember its king. The memory was liturgical, scripted, controlled. It was not a memory of a man who had overreached and failed. It was a memory of a saint who had died and triumphed. The calendar itself performed the transformation, repeating it annually, making it more true with each repetition. This is what it means to say that Olaf became Norway's eternal king. It is not a metaphor. It is a description of how a cult functions, how a memory operates, how a dead man continues to exercise influence over the living. Olaf ruled from his shrine as surely as he had ever ruled from his throne. More surely, in fact, since his throne he had held for only 15 years, while his shrine endured for nearly a millennium. The kings who came after him ruled in his shadow. They invoked his name when they wanted divine sanction. They prayed at his shrine when they wanted victory in battle. They were crowned in his cathedral, anointed before his relics, buried in his presence. He was the standard against which they were measured, and the source from which their legitimacy flowed. The dynasty that eventually established itself as the permanent royal house of Norway, the line that would rule until the country lost its independence in the 14th century, traced its authority back to Olaf. They were his heirs, not always by blood but always by claim. The sanctity of the ancestor sanctified the descendants. The martyrdom of the founder founded everything that came after. To rebel against the king was to rebel against the saint. To question the dynasty was to question the faith. Religion and politics were bound together so tightly that separating them became unthinkable. This binding had consequences that extended far beyond politics. It shaped Norwegian identity at the deepest level. To be Norwegian was to be part of the community that venerated St. Olaf. The saint was the symbol of the nation before the nation had any other way of symbolizing itself. He appeared on coins and seals. His image decorated law books and royal charters. His story was told and retold in every church in the land. Children grew up hearing his name, praying for his intercession, learning to see themselves as his people. The cult created a sense of shared identity that crossed the boundaries of region and class, that united fishermen in the north with farmers in the south, with merchants in the coastal towns. They were all subjects of the eternal king. They were all inheritors of his legacy. And what was that legacy in the end? What did it actually mean to be heir to St. Olaf? It meant Christianity, certainly. Olaf's cult was inseparable from the church that administered it. To venerate the saint was to participate in the structures of Christian worship, to accept the authority of Christian clergy, to inhabit the Christian calendar and Christian cosmology. The saint was a gateway. Through him, Norway entered fully into the community of Christian Europe, took its place among the kingdoms that acknowledged Rome, joined the great project of medieval Christendom. Olaf had baptized Norway by force. His cult completed the conversion by acculturation. What the axe had begun, the shrine finished. It meant law. The Olafslaw, whatever its origins and however much it was revised and expanded over the centuries, remained associated with the saint who was believed to have given it. Christian law in Norway was Olaf's law. To obey the law was to follow the saint's commands. The legal system carried his sanctity, his authority, his name. When kings made new laws, they made them in his tradition. When subjects obeyed, they obeyed him as much as his successors. It meant violence too. This is harder to acknowledge but impossible to deny. The cult of Saint Olaf venerated a man who had converted by force, and it did not condemn the force, it celebrated it. The axe in his hand was not an embarrassment to be explained away. It was the sign of his dedication, the proof of his zeal, the symbol of what he had been willing to do for the faith. Later, Norwegian kings who used force against pagans, against heretics, against the insufficiently faithful, could claim to be following his example. The saint had shown the way. The axe was holy. The sun had gone dark over Stiklestad. In the darkness, a man had died. In the light that returned, a saint had been born. And Norway would spend the next 1,000 years living in that light, warming itself by that sanctity, seeing itself reflected in that transformed face. The king who had failed became the king who could not fail. The man who had been killed became the man who protected. The warrior whose violence had driven his subjects to rebellion became the patron whose intercession healed the sick and comforted the grieving. The transformation was complete. The paradox resolved itself by becoming invisible, by becoming so much a part of the landscape that no one thought to question it anymore. Norway had its saint, the saint had his shrine, the shrine had its miracles. And somewhere beneath all of it, beneath the silver and the gold and the incense and the prayers, beneath the hymns and the histories and the hagiographies, the bones remained. Human, once, still. The bones remained. Human, once, still. But bones are strange relics. They persist when everything else decays. They outlast flesh and memory and the political arrangements that first gave them meaning. They sit in their reliquaries while dynasties rise and fall, while borders shift, while the very language spoken around them changes beyond recognition. The bones of Olaf Haraldsson remained in Nidaros while Norway passed through centuries of transformation, while the medieval kingdom became something else entirely, while the faith that had made him a saint underwent its own violent revolution. The Reformation came to Scandinavia in the 16th century. It came with the force of royal decree, with the confiscation of church property, with the dismantling of the structures that had sustained Catholic worship for 500 years. In Denmark-Norway, it came in 1536, when the Danish king Christian III imposed Lutheranism on his dominions and seized the wealth of the Catholic Church. The monasteries were dissolved, the bishops were imprisoned or exiled, the shrines were stripped of their treasures, and Nidaros, the great pilgrimage center, the heart of Norwegian Christianity, the place where Olaf had lain in glory for 5 centuries, fell with the rest. The details of what happened to the shrine are disputed, lost in the confusion of a religious revolution that its architects did not always document and its opponents did not survive to record. The silver and gold were certainly taken, melted down to fill royal coffers depleted by religious war. The precious stones were pried from their settings. The elaborate reliquary that had housed the saint's body was destroyed or dismantled. The pilgrims stopped coming because there was nothing left to come to, and because the new faith taught that such pilgrimages were superstition, that the veneration of relics was idolatry, that the saints were dead and could neither hear prayers nor grant intercessions. What happened to the bones themselves is less clear. Some accounts say they were buried secretly, hidden by faithful Catholics who hoped the old religion would return. Some say they were placed beneath the floor of the cathedral, unmarked and unvenerated. Some say they were simply destroyed, scattered, disposed of as the worthless remains of a superstition the kingdom had outgrown. The most likely truth is that no one knows. The bones that had been the most sacred objects in Norway, that had drawn pilgrims from across Europe, that had defined Norwegian identity for half a millennium, simply vanished into the silence of a religious revolution that had no use for them. The shrine was gone. The cult was suppressed. The feast day remained on the calendar, but its meaning changed, became something Protestant and national rather than Catholic and universal. Saint Olaf became King Olaf, a historical figure, a founder of the nation, but no longer an intercessor, no longer a worker of miracles, no longer a presence to whom the faithful could pray. The Reformation did not destroy his memory. It transformed it, secularized it, stripped it of its supernatural dimensions. The eternal king became a mortal king who had died long ago, whose importance was historical rather than spiritual, whose legacy was national rather than salvific. And yet, memory is stubborn, meaning persists in strange ways. The cathedral at Trondheim, built over the site where Olaf's bones had lain, remained standing. It fell into disrepair, suffered fires, lost its original grandeur, but it did not disappear. When Norwegian nationalism revived in the 19th century, when Norway sought independence from the union with Sweden that had replaced the union with Denmark, the figure of Olaf returned with it. Not as a saint, not as a worker of miracles, but as a symbol of Norwegian identity, a reminder that Norway had once been a kingdom in its own right, that it had its own history, its own heroes, its own founding father. The restoration of the Nidaros Cathedral became a national project. Architects studied medieval techniques, craftsmen learned forgotten skills. Stone by stone, the great church was rebuilt, not as a Catholic shrine, but as a national monument, a temple to Norwegian identity with Olaf at its center. The place where he had lain in glory became once again a place of pilgrimage, though the pilgrims now came not to pray for miracles, but to connect with their history, to stand where their ancestors had stood, to feel themselves part of a continuity that stretched back 1,000 years. The transformation is worth pausing over. A man who had been venerated as a saint, whose bones had been the most sacred objects in the kingdom, whose intercession had been sought by the sick and the desperate and the dying, became a national symbol, a secular icon, a figure whose importance was cultural rather than religious. The sacred king became the historical king. The worker of miracles became the founder of the nation. The shrine became a monument. It is tempting to see this as a loss, a diminishment, a flattening of meaning. And in some ways, it was. The Olaf of modern Norwegian nationalism is a smaller figure than the Saint Olaf of medieval devotion. He cannot heal the sick or protect sailors or intercede with God on behalf of the faithful. He is merely a man who died long ago and whose memory the nation has chosen to preserve. But there is another way to read the story. The fact that Olaf survived the Reformation, survived the suppression of his cult, survived the destruction of his shrine, survived the dispersal or destruction of his bones, suggests something about the depth of his hold on Norwegian identity. He could not be erased, he could not be forgotten, even when the faith that had made him a saint was rejected, even when the structures that had sustained his cult were dismantled. He remained transformed but persistent, a figure around whom Norwegian identity continued to organize itself. The eternal king, it seems, truly was eternal, though not in the way the medieval hagiographers had meant. What are we to make of this story in the end? What does it mean, 1,000 years later, that a Viking raider who burned his way across the Baltic and the North Sea, who forced baptisms at sword point, who was driven from his kingdom by subjects who could no longer endure his rule, who died in a battle against his own people under a darkened sun, became the most revered figure in Norwegian history, the saint whose bones drew pilgrims from across Europe, the eternal king in whose name the nation defined itself? The sources cannot answer this question. The sources can tell us what happened, or what the people who wrote them believed had happened, or what they wanted later generations to believe had happened. They cannot tell us what it meant. Meaning is not a historical fact. It is a construction, a story we tell ourselves about the past in order to understand the present, and it changes as we change. But we can observe some things. We can observe that the transformation of Olaf from failed king to eternal saint required work. It was not automatic. It was not inevitable. It was the product of deliberate effort by people who had reasons to want it to happen. Grimkel and the other early promoters of the cult had their reasons. The later kings who supported the shrine and enriched it with donations had their reasons. The church that administered the cult and profited from the pilgrimages had its reasons. The transformation was not a miracle in the supernatural sense. It was a social process, a political process, a cultural process carried out by people pursuing their own interests and serving their own needs. We can observe that the transformation required the forgetting of certain things and the remembering of others. The Olaf of the hagiographies is not the Olaf of the sagas, and neither is quite the Olaf who actually lived. The violent Christianizer who had driven his subjects to rebellion became the gentle saint who healed the sick. The king whose rule had been so harsh that his own farmers had risen against him became the eternal king whose reign was justice and peace. The forgetting was as important as the remembering. Without it, the transformation could not have occurred. We can observe that the transformation served real needs. Medieval Norway needed a saint. It needed a way to participate in the broader structures of Christian Europe. It needed a symbol around which a sense of national identity could form. It needed a sacred center, a place of pilgrimage, a source of prestige. Olaf filled all these needs. His cult was not merely imposed from above, it was embraced from below by ordinary Norwegians who found in the story of the martyred king something that spoke to their own lives, their own hopes, their own fears. The miracles at his tomb were reported by the people who believed they had experienced them. The cult grew because it met real needs, and we can observe that the story is not over. Olaf's legacy continues to shape Norway in ways both obvious and subtle. The cathedral at Trondheim remains a place of pilgrimage. Norwegian kings are still crowned there, or were until the practice was discontinued in the 20th century, and their connection to Olaf is still invoked in the ceremonies that mark their accession. The feast of Saint Olaf is still celebrated on July 29th, and though the celebration is no longer explicitly Catholic, it remains a day of national significance, a moment when Norwegians pause to remember their history and their identity. The bones are gone. No one knows what happened to them, whether they lie hidden beneath the cathedral floor, or were scattered to the winds of the Reformation, or were simply lost in the confusion of religious revolution. But the absence of the bones has not diminished the power of the story. In some ways, it has enhanced it. The bones were always just bones, fragments of a body that had once housed a consciousness, once moved through the world, once made decisions and experienced consequences. The meaning was never in the calcium and phosphorus. It was in the story, in the narrative that surrounded them, in the uses to which they were put by the living. The story persists because stories are harder to destroy than bones. You can burn a reliquary, you can scatter ashes, you can suppress a cult and dismantle a shrine. But you cannot unremember a memory that has been woven into the fabric of a culture. You cannot erase a figure who has become part of how a people understand themselves. The bones were vehicles for the story, not the story itself. When the vehicles were destroyed, the story found other vehicles. It always does. On a summer morning in the year 1030, under a sky that was about to go dark, a man stood on a hillside in central Norway and watched an army of farmers march toward him. He was 35 years old, or near enough, and he had been a raider and a baptizer and a king and an exile. He had sailed the northern seas from the Baltic to the English Channel. He had burned ships and churches and the homes of those who defied him. He had knelt in the waters of the Seine and risen as a Christian. He had returned to Norway with a fleet and a claim and a vision of what his kingdom could become. He had ruled for 15 years, and in those years he had broken the old gods and established the new faith and written laws and built churches and made enemies of every powerful man in the land. Now the enemies had come for him, and the sun was about to disappear, and he was about to die. What did he think in those final moments? The sources do not say. The saga writers were not inside his head, and neither are we. We can imagine fear or resignation or defiance or some combination too complex for any single word. We can imagine him looking at the men who had come to kill him and recognizing faces he knew, men he had ruled, subjects who should have been his but who had chosen Denmark instead. We can imagine him looking at his own men, the loyal few who had followed him from Russia, the farmers who had joined him on his march, and knowing that they were not enough, that they had never been enough, that his gamble had failed. But we cannot know. The human being who stood on that hillside and felt the grass beneath his feet and smelled the wind and heard the sounds of an army preparing for battle, who experienced whatever he experienced and thought whatever he thought, is irrecoverable. We have only the aftermath, only the stories told by people who were not there, only the meanings imposed by centuries of use and reuse. The sky went dark. The battle began. The king fell. His body was hidden in a shed, buried in sand, retrieved and washed and found to be uncorrupted. His blood healed a blind man, or so the stories say. The enemies who had killed him began to see visions, to experience regrets, to wonder if they had murdered a saint. Within a year, the body was in a shrine. Within a decade, the miracles were multiplying. Within a century, he was the most important saint in Scandinavia. Within a millennium, he was the eternal king of Norway, the founder of the nation, the face on the coins and seals and standards. The transformation is the story. The paradox is the point. A man who failed became a man who could not fail. A king who was killed by his own people became the king who belonged to his people forever. A life of violence became a death of sanctity. The darkness over Stiklestad gave way to light that has not yet faded. Norway still exists. The cathedral at Trondheim still stands. The story is still told. And somewhere beneath the layers of meaning, beneath the centuries of interpretation, beneath the nationalism and the hagiography and the scholarly analysis, there remains what there always was. A man who lived. A man who died. And the stories we tell about him, which say more about us than they ever could about him. The sun sets over the fjords, the water holds the last light, the mountains stand in shadow as they have stood for millions of years, as they will stand for millions more. They do not remember the king who died on their slopes. They do not know the saint whose shrine drew pilgrims to their valleys. They are stone and snow and silence. But we remember. We cannot help it. Memory is what we are. Olaf lies somewhere in Norway, or his bones do, or what remains of them, or nothing at all. It does not matter. He lives in the story. He has lived there for 1,000 years.